think we'll just give it a minute and see if anybody else arrives, and then maybe we can kick off. I just feel like there should be some music to play during this moment while you're sort of waiting for the last few. I don't know what OA Books music would sound like, but let's see if we can find some.
Lucy, we should play some of Martin's music.
We should, yeah.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
What was it? Something, was it disco? Something disco?
It was disco. Yes, Martin Paul Eve, he actually makes music in his spare time because apparently he has some spare time, which is unbelievable. Yeah, it's disco.
Okay, we'll get some of that next time.
Yeah, we should. Yeah, exactly. We should dig for it for our next meeting then.
Okay.
Toby is here. Is it this Toby that I think? Toby, is it you, Toby?
That's me, yeah. Hi there.
Hi. Nice to see you. Hi.
Nice to see all of you. Hi.
Okay, so I think we can begin. Just to reiterate again that we're recording the session, so if you prefer not to be in the video, please turn your camera off. And welcome everyone back to the first bookmarks of 2021. Just in case any of you haven't been to a bookmarks talk before, these are open conversations that we have with people who are doing interesting work in the field of open access books. And one of us who is hosting today, it's me, will ask questions of our guests. And if at any point you have something that you want to ask, please feel free to drop it in the chat on Zoom. Or if at the end, if we have time, I can open the floor up for people to ask their questions in person if that's what you prefer. My name's Lucy Barnes, and I'm an editor and outreach coordinator at Open Book Publishers. And I'm delighted to say that today we're speaking to Jeff Pooley. Jeff is the founder and director of Media Studies Press, which is a scholar-led, not-for-profit open access publisher in the media studies fields. The press was founded, I think, last year, right, Jeff? And it publishes books and journals. And as the press describes itself on its website, we publish living works with iterative updates stitched into our process. And we encourage multimodal submissions that reflect the mediated environments our authors study. So Jeff, thank you very much for coming and for being a guest on the bookmarks today. It's great to have you.
Thank you for inviting me. I was so thrilled to see Open Access Book Network emerge out of nowhere to me. I hadn't known it was in the planning stages, so I've been following it with avid interest. Thanks for the invitation.
That's great to hear. I'm really looking forward to getting into the conversation about the press, about how it works, about some of the decisions that you've made in creating it. So I'm just going to kick off with a very sort of basic question, which is, why did you decide to begin the press?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't have a background in publishing. In fact, most of the folks in this room know much more, I suspect, about the nuts and bolts, although I've certainly scaled up fast over the last year or so. But I am a media scholar by background, and I write on the history of social science, the history of media research as it intersects with the social sciences and the humanities. And I've also, in the last 5 years or so, started to write about open access issues, particularly in the field of media studies, broadly conceived. And I've advocated for it, critiqued the APC, things like this. And I started to feel like I didn't understand the scholarly publishing world well enough to be issuing critiques like this and entering into debates, that there should be, that I should have some knowledge, and I should also, in some sense, practice what I preach. And I was very intrigued by the formation in 2019, I think it was, of Scholar-Led, the coalition of scholar-led presses that includes open book publishers, but also some others like Punctum. And I went to a library publishing forum in Seattle that same year and became very interested in the prospect of actually kind of learning more about the publishing process, in part to inform my writing, but also to kind of enact the things I claim to be believing in my articles on these topics. So that, and frankly, just sheer curiosity. I'm like deeply interested in infrastructures, backends, metadata, standards, etc. So learning all of that too was a motivation.
Mm-hmm. So kind of learning while doing, I guess, in a very kind of basic way of putting it. And what was the biggest kind of initial challenge when you were setting up?
Well, the biggest challenge probably had to do with the platform itself. I imagined a digital first and perhaps digital only operation. And this immediately raised the question of what kind of platform should be used. And I initially spun out a DigitalOcean droplet and installed with some difficulty and some help from my own university's IT people, a installation of Janeway, the actually speaking of Martin Eve, the Open Library of Humanities platform that Andy Byers has developed and that is supported by the Mellon Foundation. It's a really wonderful platform. And I thought that this could be the serials, the journal platform. And then I also, at the same time, installed Manifold, which is that Iron Code collaboration, also Mellon funded from, I think, the University of Minnesota Press and CUNY, that can host longer form materials. And frankly, though I've really enjoyed working and learning about both platforms, and I think they're both really worthy of use and support, and they're being deployed all over the place and iterated in exciting ways. The challenge of maintaining both of those platforms, every iterative update was a terrifying enterprise, like, working in the back end of the command line and so on. And then also, managing a WordPress site on top of it, it got to be taking up so much of my relatively scarce time that I became intrigued by PubPub. And part of the reason, so this was the biggest challenge to answer your question, and it was the reason I ended up switching to the platform that MediaStudies.press currently sits on, which is PubPub, the MIT Press / MIT Media Lab collaboration. And I knew, of course, that I wanted to be in an open source nonprofit platform, but the attractiveness of PubPub is that it became more and more capable over the months. Frankly, it was being updated so quickly. And I saw Travis Rich talk at a library publishing forum. He is the kind of MIT Media Lab PhD whose dissertation was on the concept of PubPub, and then and started it thereafter and founded that Knowledge Futures group, which is its current home. And I just, in terms of the question you asked, Lucy, around challenge, the fact that it was one platform that could handle both monographs and serials and publications, and that it could also serve as the landing page, even though it's quite inflexible in those terms. The simplicity, and then fundamentally the fact that it's hosted, proved to be really attractive. I guess I'll add one last facet of that has nothing to do with the feature set of PubPub, which I'm very happy to talk about, that made that move attractive, was that it has a sustainability pathway, which is to say it's planning to roll out very shortly. It had announced this plan from the beginning to charge hosting fees that were reasonable and directed at nonprofit publishers, but nevertheless had a way of maintaining itself past a Mellon Foundation grant or past the support of Reid Hoffman, who bizarrely is one of its early patrons, thanks to the MIT Media Lab. And so that fact of kind of its long-term resiliency mattered too. And that's a long way of answering what the biggest challenge was. It was technical, and it was managing those two hosted platforms, or self-hosted platforms, I should say.
Mm. And as the person who sort of decided to set this up, did you have people who you could call on to give you advice or help with this, or were you kind of trying to do this all yourself?
I mean, I did have help from someone in my institution, which is a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. And he is an open access advocate and open source software developer in his free time. And he helped me in various ways on the mechanics and some of that. I also started just reaching out to people like Eileen Joy at Punctum, Dan Rudman there as well. Actually, someone who's here, Tim Elfenbein, who is our infrastructure editor, I reached out to. And part of this was the process of creating an advisory board, which you can find on the website, involves a number of folks, but these were people who I either had already reached out to for advice and who had generously agreed to meet over Zoom, or who I met through the invitation. And that's part of what attracted me along the way. I should mention also the Radical OA Collective, which is, I think, familiar to most of you, but it's, I think it's at Coventry, and it involves a sort of consortium that's pretty horizontal of like-minded groups. And the ethos of both scholar-led, then the COPM, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, group of the initiative, I guess you'd say, which many of you are probably involved in it, but it's the community-led open monograph something publishing, I suspect is the acronym. And the Radical OA group all have this ethos of sort of sharing knowledge and orienting the community towards cooperation rather than competition. And I think some of that will be like formally stitched into COPM as it comes out, but it was already there as a kind of ethic that was very clearly stated in scholar-led activities. And that just got to be enacted in my early months of setting this up, because I called people and set up meetings and they were very willing to just share their knowledge.
Mm-hmm. And how much was your work affected by the fact that all this happened last year when the whole world went a bit mad? How was it affected by COVID and by all those other things?
Well, because it's such a small operation, the personal effects on me had delayed things, I would say, by by probably 6 months. And that just has to do with school closures and the astonishing criminal mishandling of the coronavirus in the United States, which and I've, a special need child. And so it did set back the press for reasons that had just to do with my own work time and personal life. But otherwise, it wasn't anything like an impediment, just because so much of the setting up of the press had to do with distributed remote work as it was. And yeah, I mean, and so I imagine that the library subsidy model that I'm working to enact will be deeply affected by the pandemic in terms of library budget cuts and those factors that are also realigning some of the university sector, I think, in ways of accelerating changes that were already happening. But for the press itself, it didn't delay things outside of my own time and personal issues.
Mm-hmm. And to talk a little bit about that library funding model, can you say a bit more about why you chose it and how you kind of see it working?
I mean, this may be my most important commitment because it's the one that initially got me interested in open access publishing in the monograph world as well, which is the very widespread critique of the way that open access has developed in terms of an article processing charge and or the counterpart in our world, the book processing charge, and the way in which that APC essentially shifts the burden of denying access from readers to authors, and that outside of funded, and this is just repeating, I'll be so brief about it, but outside of funded natural scientists and other scholars in a few rich Western European countries that have national deals, and scholars at a handful of especially wealthy North American institutions, there is effectively a barrier to publishing open access. And as the shift happens, there will be a kind of barrier to authorship altogether, I think, in some ways. And the waiver system that exists is rickety, extremely limited, and condescending, and has other problems that we could talk about. So I've been very interested in collective funding models, and I have written about this, and that's where I first got interested. And I kind of tried to trace the history of the APC and the history of alternative thinking about it. And so some folks in the mid 2000s were writing about alternative models, and Ray Crow, if that's how you pronounce his name, and others. But really in the early 2010s, there was an emergence of a model that had libraries, or in some cases, funders like national research councils or foundations, directly funding publishing operations. And so like Knowledge Unlatched in its early nonprofit phase was one example in the 2012 or so. We mentioned Martin Eve already. The Open Library of Humanities library partnership model was another. Archive, the venerable physics, mathematics, computer science preprint server set something up like this. Scope 3, the CERN-based particle physics journal consortium. All of these were, I guess there's also, I was thinking of another one that I was excited and still am excited about that is based in the US, that is a monograph publisher, Lever Press. All of these were sort of set up around that same time, 2012, 2013, 14, on the premise that there is all of this spending that takes place in the library budgets currently, that it's enough somehow, or it's enough in theory to fund a system that is open access, and that it should be the mechanism, some kind of third-party collective funding. And so I've been just very curious about and following all of the twists and turns on this front. I know this is a sort of long-winded answer, but I think it's worth a quick digression, is that there are a few key hinge points in the basic model of doing collective funding like this. One of them I haven't thought about at all, though I think it's so crucial, and I hope COPIM is really thinking about, which is scale. It's not sustainable to have MediaStudies.press and open book publishers and Punctum to all be kind of going hand in hand to libraries one by one. It's logistically unworkable. It is, it's not sustainable. There are all kinds of problems with that. But setting aside for a second that huge issue, I think there are two interesting divergences taking place in how this non-APC collective funding model is getting rolled out. And one of them is about the recruiting of library members, let's say, and sometimes that word is not used, but something like the libraries that sort of quote unquote kind of buy into these models. One approach, which I do think that Open Library of Humanities is a good stand-in for, is you might think of as like more altruistic. It's appealing to libraries' responsibility and their mission as supporting and helping to spread scholarly knowledge, and without regard to a strict calculus of return on investment. And that approach is probably going to be greatly tested by the pandemic, I'm guessing. I'm sure Martin would have something to say about that, but that approach relies in some ways on the mission-driven sense of librarians. The second model is also, you might think of it as coercive. I don't think that word has such a negative connotation. I don't mean it to, but the approach that PLOS is taking, the Public Library of Science, with its community action publishing model, is an example of this, where yes, you rely on librarians' interest in supporting academic publishing in a mission-driven sense. So you don't dispense with that altruism, but you also introduce a kind of stick. And the way that the PLOS is doing it is by raising quite dramatically the APCs for the journals that are in this pilot for non-members. So they're like essentially almost doubling, and the members obviously don't have APCs for their for publishing in these two journals that they're piloting this with. The annual reviews effort to do subscribe to open has a similar kind of stick model where they're basically saying if we don't get 95% participation, we might just pull it all back. Both of these approaches are an attempt to sort of like deal with the collective action problem of worrying about a few, maybe even a small number of institutions out of their benevolence shouldering all of the cost, and a massive number of free riders then taking advantage of those few. And I think this hinge point is really interesting because it gets at sort of idealism versus practical hard realities, perhaps. It also gets at the kind of human nature questions about whether librarians are calculating self-interested individuals, whether laws constrain them to be as such, as might be true in some jurisdictions, whether strict transactional cost-benefit analysis style thinking is what does and should operate in scholarly communication. I really hope that the OLH altruistic model is successful, and it's the one I'd like to roll out for Media Studies Press. So that's a long-winded answer of the first big hinge point. And the second one is related, and I think also breaks down on sort of ethical grounds, which is how do you determine tiering and payment or membership fees, for want of a better term? And there do seem to be, as in the kind of membership recruiting side, two different approaches. One of them is like PLOS, and like many others is based, I think Archive and Scope 3 is based on the number of authors in a way. Like PLOS is doing it this way, where they're looking at the 5-year, I think, some kind of average of any institution's authors, including second, third, fourth, not just corresponding authors, and using some formula to charge or sort institutions into tiers. And those tiers have different membership fees attached to them, and they're obviously graduated on a scale. So the idea in this version is to basically more or less, even though you're assessing an annual levy, base it on the use, not the use, well, it's in some ways the kind of the authorship side of things. And a second approach, which probably would and does involve some use metric, takes into account ability to pay. And OLH, again, the Open Library of Humanities, is a good example of this one, where the library subsidy scheme that Martin Eve set up explicitly charges institutions different amounts for where they are in the world. I don't know, you can look on their website about, but they, I don't know if they tier it off of some official statistics of GDP per capita, but it's at least based in part on national income or national wealth and institution size. And it doesn't make the number of authors the key metric for determining the tier or band of payment. And there again, I think this one is more important, that the approach be taken, that any kind of library subsidy scheme like this involve ability to pay as one of its key contributors, because otherwise something like the PLOS model risks excluding authors in just the way that the read and publish deals are doing, where most of the world's scholars are not going to have institutions that can pay for memberships, even if their authors tend not to publish much and therefore aren't charged much. That this is just, it has to be like a marginal income tax rate, maybe even in the Scandinavian sense, where some people, a large number, don't pay anything. Those who have more money pay quite a bit more over a certain marginal amount, something like that. And anyway, that's a really long-winded way of explaining partly why I wanted to take some time to roll out the library partnership model for Media Studies Press. And Tim, who's here, is on the board as well, and I want to discuss this with him in our board meeting in a short while. But I'm really interested in watching what comes out of COPIM on this front. And secondly, speaking of Ray Crow, what comes out of the MIT Press Ray Crow partnership that is underway. It's an Arcadia-funded project to develop business model ideas for open access monographs. And so I'm kind of curious about the whole space, but definitely committed to a non-BPC model. And right now, I should just say that the press is very lean, in part because it's just operating on my personal donations. And it's not meant, that's not sustainable, obviously. It's a deliberate strategy to have a bridge to a library partnership model.
So I'm right in saying that the model is still being set up, then it's not kind of up and running yet, the library aspect of it.
Yeah, that in fact is the main operational goal of 2021, is to unveil it in the beginning of 2022. And my hope is that some of these projects will start really, I mean, they already have in Copham's case, but start releasing information and models and even platforms possibly.
Mm-hmm. So I guess, I mean, I don't know if anyone has any questions about that aspect, about the funding side of things. Are you thinking that will be like once it's up and running, are you thinking that the library funding will be the only sort of income stream, or I guess combined with sales as well? Or are you thinking there'll be other sources of income?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that it's going to be alongside sales, the main source of income, and it's going to remain a small operation that involves lots of volunteer labor, and that raises all kinds of important problems, or at least questions around whether, you know, a model like this one that's boutique and involving lots of donated labor, is that scalable? Is it that kind of thing? I know that's being debated already by lots of people, I suspect at Copham and elsewhere. But yes, I mean, I did set up with Tim's help and others the publishing, an actual print publishing operation, which I can answer a question about. And that was in part because I was so intrigued by how open book publishers and Punctum and others have, despite being totally open access, managed to generate something like, in some cases, maybe a fifth to up to 40% of income from sales to libraries and individuals. So that would be another stream in theory that you know, would supplement the library partnership scheme.
Yeah. There's a question from Eric in the chat. He says, since we're talking about library funding models, how do you think libraries should allocate funds among the many deserving publishers? How would your publisher fare against OLH, Punctum, Plus, Archive, etc.?
I mean, that's the sort of question I sidestepped when I was referring to the scale, because I think it's a massive problem and requires some kind of consortium model of some sort. And, you know, obviously, in some ways, this is above my pay grade, though I'm very, very interested and want to hear debates around it. I mean, you can imagine all kinds of challenges that relate to mostly sort of membership in a consortium, and then the proportion of funding that goes out from the consortium to the publishing and other open access nonprofit entities that are presumably supported through it. And the politics around formulae will be really complicated because you can imagine so many different metrics. But fundamentally, I don't mean to diminish the challenge that involves both logistics and political and ethical decisions. But fundamentally, I think some kind of consortium, I think of one that might be around nonprofit community-led publishing that would take in library funds and somehow send them out, and in a way that wasn't involving setting up Punctum against open book publishers, but in some more cooperative manner. I don't mean to suggest that will be easy.
But I think it's something
I hope that's giving you an answer.
Yeah, I think it's something that Copham, I mean, work package 2 of Copham, I'm just going to put a link in the chat. I think this is their latest, the latest thing that they've put out. But that is kind of grappling with this problem. So if anyone's not aware of it, there's a link there to their latest post. But yeah, this problem of how to sort of scale small publishers such that they don't have to themselves become huge entities, but together there can be a kind of a sort of heft to what they're doing. Yeah, I think it's one of the most interesting and probably difficult problems that that a lot of smaller open access book presses are grappling with. So another thing that I wanted to ask you about was you say on the website that you want to make it easy for authors to release iterative citable updates of their work. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how the kind of versioning process works and why it's important in your view.
Well, this in some ways is a field-specific issue because media studies scholars, those who are writing about the present, are in what is a very kinetic discipline, right? That is, the object of study is changing rapidly. And it's plain that the publishing process itself is maybe sclerotic in some sense, but either way, even if you could narrow down the publishing time frame in the article or book world, it would still remain the case that the pace of change is really fast. So I teach a class, for example, called Social Media and the Self, and lots of the academic literature is about social media that's in the grave, like that's long been dead because they've been vanquished by others or upstarts. And this sort of issue isn't easily resolvable. I don't think versioning is a great answer, but it's one piece of an answer, which is to allow authors, particularly for works that might have a longer shelf life if they could be updated. I'm thinking mainly in the media studies case of the media landscape changing rapidly, but it could also be to incorporate new secondary research and the rest. So the principle is there. And of course, the book publishing world has the edition system from longstanding that second and third and fourth editions are published. And this, however, I think PubPub in particular is one of its positive virtues, aside from the fact that I was referring to, like its hosting and some of the simplicity, but it borrows from, quite plainly, though it doesn't state this exactly, from GitHub and the kind of software versioning world, lots of metaphors and user interface. So that, for example, if you've been on PubPub's backend, there are the concept of releases, and you can, just like in a kind of Git style versioning system, go back in time to older versions. And they, one of the reasons I was attracted to them is this support for versions. They also have DOIs stitched in really well. They don't yet have, I've issued a kind of ticket, but they don't yet have what I think to be like the best DOI related version process that I know of, which is Zenodo, the European data store. They have a system where essentially you sign a DOI for all versions, and then there is a DOI for each specific version as well. And right now, PubPub, to my knowledge, doesn't support the kind of all versions DOI. But it does have like minting inside of its own backend and so on. It's quite well done. And so in a sense, when it comes to the identifiers, there's already a way to do this that has citability formats already in place. But the way I sort of see it, with lots of concern about porting, speaking of metaphors from software, the idea of like a point release being something significant enough, but not a full addition to justify a new DOI and a new kind of version, and then and like a full release, number release would be like an addition in the sense of a new ISBN, and even possibly the language of addition. But this is, again, just so new. We published our first two books only in October and November, so the prospect of versioning is more theoretical, though very much planned, but it hasn't yet been implemented.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, given that you said the first two books were published in October, November, so it's still very much early days, but I was wondering if you've given much thought, if you have much resources to put towards marketing and publicity, because I think, I suppose as one aspect of discoverability as well, given that we were talking about metadata before we began the chat. How are you kind of going about tackling that side of the press's work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, some of it is, I do think that this is a space where being a scholar in the field can help, although I don't want to oversell that. But one strategy that we have used is to actually write to scholars directly who might be interested in the work. And I happen, it's just something that's a little more familiar if you're in these fields. And also so that holds to some extent for the appropriate listservs and the norms around them and how you can use them. And one area that I'm still very keen to learn from open book publishers and the other scholar-led presses is approaching libraries in particular. And so, I actually have a kind of gaping hole in our marketing on that front that I'm actively hoping to develop this year. But the main strategy of marketing is discoverability, in essence, I think, which is to say that our strategy, which is not unique, I think Open Book Publishers does this, and it was kind of the inspiration, is to spread the books out as far and wide as possible to as many platforms and as many formats as possible, so that what we've done is create, and again, this is not that novel or anything, but the HTML version on PubPub, of course, and then we have a PDF and an EPUB and Mobi and a paperback version, but the platforms are OAPN, of course, and Ronald and Tom represent that, but also Project Muse and Internet Archive and even Google Books and Apple Books, and I'm sure I'm forgetting another platform or two, and we will join others as well. And it's the discoverability through, for example, Project Muse's integration with lots of library catalogs and the OCLC integration and that kind of thing that makes discoverability a priority more than maybe traditional marketing.
Eric's put a question in the chat again about going back to versioning. He says you're creating new versions of PD books. How do you see versioning working there? Not sure what PD books are.
Yeah, Eric, what do you mean by PD books? Oh, yes. Oh, that's a great point, because I should mention that we started out on purpose with public domain books. And this was just a self-conscious strategy to ramp up in a way that was feasible, because we would work through the process of learning and getting workflows established without live human authors. And I do think this is a really rich area actually to that a scholar-led press in particular can do good work in, because you can identify works that are unpublished in the public domain in some cases, or in the public domain but long out of print and hard to find. But it's a good question. Like you could make some modifications, but the versioning for, say, Our Master's Voice, which is this book we published in October, that's a 1934 James Rorty classic critique of advertising, has a new introduction and a preface, and those two works could be independently versioned. And the way that the press is set up, this is really a PubPub fact, but everything is composed of individual pubs, including like, let's say, the introduction to that public domain work, and it itself can be separate. It has its own DOI, but it can be updated, and then if there is a significant point update, then all of the other platforms I mentioned, a new PDF will be generated and distributed to each of the platforms. And I'm not sure yet about if there's a significant update, how I guess the new paperback edition would be issued as well. But does that answer your question? Like, I don't imagine updating the public domain work itself, but the material that helps introduce it and the critical footnoting and the like.
Eric, are you typing more, or is that answered your? So, oh.
Yeah, no, that's true. Some public domain books have hundreds of versions. That's very true. That's right. I mean, I suppose, and of course, a public domain work doesn't, in many cases, especially in the kind of ancient and medieval and early modern periods, there aren't canonical versions of anything and so on. I mean, most of the work that we're thinking of doing public domain terms is in the modern publishing era, where there is typically more certainty about what the version of record is. But anyway, that's a great question. I hadn't thought about that.
So you mentioned a few times that you've reached out to other scholar-led publishers, and that the press itself, your press, is currently quite a lean operation. So I wondered what other forms of support you might have found in the open access book publishing community, and particularly the scholar-led community. And also, going on from that, if you think there are any obvious gaps or areas that people could be thinking more about in terms of providing support to new publishers.
Yeah, well, I'll give you a concrete example of how I did rely on the community, which was, I originally hadn't thought, and Tim and I talked about this and others, we weren't sure whether there would be any kind of paperback publishing operation at all, that it would be digital only was a possibility. And partly because of the fact that there was some interest in paperback and also the prospect of generating some funding, changed our minds about that. And I reached out in this case to a Punctum person named Dan Rudman, some of you may know him, and said just like, I know nothing about this world. Can you share your knowledge? And he's currently thinking about, I think he deals with a lot of this on Punctum side, and he had done research. So he suggested a couple of places, and he ended up directing us to a particular UK-based site that isn't part of the kind of Amazon Ingram duopoly that is print on demand worldwide. And in fact, we've been kind of going back and forth about the experience, because I think they're considering and talking about possibly using them. I don't know if that's true or not. But in any event, the process of selecting that print on demand operation came from consulting with Dan Rudman. And in general, I think that there are, so that's just an example of how that's helped. And by the way, I've had a good experience with I don't know if anyone else is familiar with that operation, but they have a really user-friendly, I think someone could throw it in the chat. I don't have my browser open, but it's print on demand worldwide. And they have a user interface that's pretty friendly. They have a responsive team. They allow very small batch ordering. They have their own wholesaling stitched in if you want it. And they're very flexible with dimensions and aspects like that. And also paper type and quality. And so they've been really quite good. And I think that kind of knowledge sharing is really crucial. And maybe another example that I had to figure out with Tim's help, but not in an organized way, is all of the slew of metadata and formatting and standardizations, this entire universe that is utterly familiar to all of you, that I knew only as a consumer of books and articles, that we had to learn along the way. And it was deeply interesting and in fact, quite thrilling. I mean, every step of learning what Onyx referred to, or Mark, and the Library of Congress as back in, all of it was like the most exciting time to sort of see that back end and try to think about it a little bit. But it nevertheless was a lot of trial and error labor and steep learning curves that I imagine could be shared more systematically in a way. And this, I suspect, is something of what COPUM is hoping to do. I don't know, but that's I think there's a lot of like infrastructural and back-end knowledge sharing that could be rolled out, and that would be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's certainly for me one of the more sort of impenetrable aspects of open access book publishing. And in terms of particularly being a scholar-led press, I mean, you mentioned that there may be an advantage to it in the sense of being able to help circulate the books, to share them with people, to already be plugged into the scholarly networks that will be using them. And I wondered if there were any other advantages or any particular drawbacks that you saw to being scholar-led rather than, sort of external to the scholarly world.
I mean, one problem that's obvious is that the professional expertise is missing for the most part. I think another problem has to do with labor itself, that there is this expectation at many scholar-led presses, particularly the smaller, younger ones, that most of the labor, perhaps outside of copy editing, proofing, and maybe design and a couple of other things, is volunteer. And there's this kind of culture that's quite lovely in the academic world, that we are paid by our universities and work on our scholarship as part of that typically, especially if we're in the humanities and the humanistic social sciences, we're not funded otherwise. And but nevertheless, this is both maybe problematic as a practice of relying on volunteer labor, but it's certainly a practical problem because there's such a limited supply of it. Scholars like myself are really busy teaching, and we have waves of busyness. And so I mean that as like a practical matter. Like, I negotiated with my college, and I'm at a small liberal arts college, as I mentioned, that has a relatively high teaching load by US standards. So I'm expected to teach 3 courses a semester. And what I did, and this is not something that people could necessarily even negotiate or certainly accept, is to go to them and say, I have this project, to my administration at my college, and say, I would like to take my teaching load down by 1 course, and I'm willing to take a full 1/3 pay cut to do that. And when I say 1 course, I mean 1 course per semester, and it's for the purpose of doing this. And that was a big financial hit, but I'm very grateful they were willing to grant that. And it's the only reason I can claim that the 3 to 5 books that we're currently doing a year and going forward at least is sustainable and feasible. But so I want to just reference that practical time issue. The other, and what else I think is a problem. I'm trying to think of challenges that come from the scholar-led. I'm thinking of scale, which I just mentioned. I don't know, the learning curve too. I mean, one advantage is not, I think it's the crucial one, and it's not related to scholar-led presses exclusively, because I would include in this university presses and library publishing programs, but the effort to reclaim publishing in a way to the academic community strikes me as being so vitally important. And the way in which this very strange joint custody arrangement has emerged, whereby the academic institutions are nonprofit and the librarians, the university press folks, the academics, we all work at nonprofits, but our publishing, and it's not so true exclusively in the book world, but certainly in the article world especially, is dominated by commercial presses, and really just a few of them. In a way that mimics very eerily the kind of concentration in media more broadly in the 1980s and 90s in the UK and the US. So that arrangement whereby we outsource our publishing to, and I know I may be preaching to the choir perhaps, but to for-profits that are making 35% profit margins, strikes me as a really crucial issue, in that scholar-led, but also just community-led nonprofit publishing that includes librarians and others is indispensable. And so the advantage is mission, is not having a profit motive. And yes, there is domain knowledge that comes from academic expertise. And so that advantage is obvious and stitched in.
There was one thing that you mentioned in your blog post that I wanted to touch on. You said that a particular academic interest of yours is how and why certain ideas win out over others. And I wondered if you could apply this to the development of open access, and if you think that's an idea that's winning and what that might look like.
You know, it's one of my hobby horses, that I don't do any of this, is to exhort my fellow media academics to apply this amazing toolkit and conceptual analysis that they've developed to study social media and mainstream media corporations and public systems and so on, and apply it to scholarly communication. It's really rarely done. But in essence, I'm going to repeat myself probably a little bit, but it does look like that open access, thanks to Plan S and other dynamics underway, will happen. And it looks like it will happen with two major flaws intact, which is the APC basis and BPC basis of the system, and the related, since it's a way of maintaining profits, the commercial orientation of most of the article publishing and lots of the book publishing. And so open access, I think, is quite likely to succeed in article publishing at the very least, and that momentum is already underway. But the political economy that underlies this kind of bear hug embrace, the sort of pivot of Springer, Wiley, and Elsevier and others to embrace gold open access, it means that it's such a Pyrrhic victory to come in a way. I'm quite worried and pessimistic about if you ask me, my own half worthless prognostication that it comes at such a great cost that fundamentally has to do with barriers to access from the outside of a handful of rich Western countries and rich Western institutions. That means authorship will be contingent on, and visibility therefore, on ability to pay, that will be structured in a for-profit manner.
Yeah, that was what interested me, I think, about the concept, because the more that I've kind of been involved in open access myself, I think the more I'm realizing that open access itself, simply means the ability to access work without barriers, but all of the kind of politics and the economics behind its creation and its dissemination is not necessarily part of that the two things can almost be separated, or at least uncoupled to an extent. And yeah, like you say, we may find that open access becomes the dominant mode of publishing, but whether that means, that some of the kind of non-profit or community ethos that we've been talking about here also wins, I don't know if the two things are the same at all. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the Plan S approach has been pretty damaging in this respect, and is likely to usher in I know reasonable people can disagree about this, and I'm not a dogmatist in any way, but it strikes me that by jettisoning the APC cap, which was in the original plan, by leaning on the idea of transparency in markets, which strikes me as utterly inapplicable to scholarly publishing, particularly prestige based, monopoly titles, and by pushing read and publish deals in effect, especially as transitional ones, will have the effect of kind of baking in APCs or the equivalent of APCs in the form of these read and publish deals that I'm much more interested in rooting for the kind of Latin American model and others approaches that don't involve making sure that Elsevier can maintain its profit margin.
The other thing that you mentioned in the post was that founding the press has served as a second education. So as we kind of come towards a close in our conversation, I wondered if there's anything that you learned or have learned that we've not talked about yet.
I guess the first thing I would just say in very brief is maybe it was repeating myself to something I mentioned to a couple of you before we formally started, is that it has been a revelation in seeing the quote unquote boring parts of book publishing, and that involves the most painfully boring aspects. Like Ronald has had to deal with the Onyx file, for example, and its complications. And but I'm really keen on infrastructures being brought forward, and the idea that I'm thinking of sort of Jeffrey Bowker and his partner Starr on sorting things out, and how infrastructure is being made visible, the most boring things like actuarial tables and software standards and so on, that this is a crucial aspect of shining a light. And I guess learning about that infrastructural backend has been the piece that has been the most interesting to me, and that I'd like to write about more and expose and think about and trace histories of these metadata and so on.
Cool. And I guess my last question, I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to ask after this, but my last question was what the future of the press looks like for the next, whether that's year, 5 years, 10 years, if you're thinking that far ahead.
No, I should be probably. I have given a little bit of thought, thanks to Tim, about preservation, and both Project Muse and OAPN have Portico built in for the PDFs, at least. I'm still completely curious about the problem of more multimedia HTML only publications and how they might be preserved outside of the PDF format. But so that's a kind of long term, because it's possible and even likely that this initiative won't last forever, and that thinking about eventual folding is really important, including most fundamentally about the preservation. Otherwise, this is something that I want to talk about with my board, but I imagine rolling out our first authored monograph next year, and also publishing the first of another series called the idea is an open reader that's HTML only and that draws on open access materials that also include outbound links to free access materials that don't necessarily carry open licenses as a kind of course reader substitute, and to continue the public domain work, including publishing Goffman's communication-oriented dissertation, which is in the public domain this next year. So there are specific projects, specific series, and the aim is to publish at this scale, which is to say 3 to 5 books regularly, while ramping up the sustainability of the library funding model.
Great. So has anyone else got any questions that we've not asked that they want to ask before we close? Anyone? Okay. So in that case, thank you so much, Jeff. That was extremely interesting, and I hope everybody else enjoyed it as much as I did. And thanks to everybody for coming and for asking questions. And we're going to be sharing the video of the talk in the next few days. So if you would like to share that with your networks, that would be great. And thanks everyone for coming. Hope to see you at the next one.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I really appreciate it, having the chance. And I'm a big supporter of this open access book network.
Great. That's very nice to hear.
Good to know.
Yes.
Lovely to have you here. Okay, good. So we're done for today. I am ending the meeting. Okay.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Jeff.